Now, it's a huge pleasure to introduce Paul. I saw him, I should say, speak or perform, perhaps I should say, in Shanghai. So I know you're in for a very entertaining evening. Paul French, you know, he looks like a journalist. He dresses like a journalist. He talks like a journalist. And he just told me he drinks like a journalist. But he's not a journalist, actually. He is a writer. But he started off in Shanghai. He was telling me with a market research company that he set up. He decided that that would be much more interesting than being a journalist. So but he mixes quite a lot with writers and journalists. And we definitely feel that he's one of us. And he's going to tell us a little bit about old Shanghai, including the origins of this very club where you're sitting tonight. And he's got some interesting pictures that might make us all jealous about our former premises and indeed the lifestyles of our predecessors in this part of the world. So Paul's currently based in London, but he has lived and worked in Shanghai for many years. He's a widely published analyst, commentator, and writer on China. He wrote a book called Midnight in Peking, which was a New York Times bestseller, and I think is going to be made into an international miniseries very shortly. His recent book is City of Devils, about Shanghai, and that's partly what he's going to talk about tonight. And I think I'm right in saying that the books are available at the front there on a table, and I'm sure he'd be happy to talk to you and to sign them afterwards. So it gives me a huge pleasure to introduce Paul French. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. That's great. No, I've never been a journalist, but I've always been sort of interested in journalists. And I wrote a history of foreign journalists in China from the Opium Wars up until 1949. My interests cease after 1949. I find nothing interesting after then. But everything before I find sort of fascinating. I've been in Hong Kong for a while and then was in Beijing and Shanghai before with this new book. So the FCC said to me, can you not just talk about the book? Can you talk a little bit about journalists and so on? So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the journalists who were around during the period that this book does. So don't worry, I'm going to shoehorn in this book at every opportunity in order to encourage you to buy it. But I'm going to talk about journalists as well. And also because I saw there was a debate among lots of, particularly journalists, foreign journalists working on mainland China about rates and how difficult it was to afford to live there now. I thought I'd really annoy them, and perhaps you, by showing how wonderfully in the 1930s it was possible to live as a sort of reasonably lazy freelance journalist, if there's any other sort of freelance journalist. A reasonably lazy sort of freelance journalist in the 1930s in Shanghai or Peking. You could live an absolutely extraordinary life. So I thought I would sort of try and prove that to you. So this is a sort of thrown together presentation. So I'm hoping it's going to sort of come together. The period I'm writing about at the moment and have been researching for quite a long time and have written about in various other Penguin specials and so on is really starts on the 14th of August 1937. It starts with what was called Bloody Saturday. And it's the day when the bombs fell on Shanghai. It's a very complicated story, which I won't go into because I don't have that long, because, of course, they were an attempt by the Chinese Air Force to bomb the Japanese flag carrier that was moored in the Huangpu River in Shanghai and was shelling into the Chinese portions of Shanghai. So Shanghai, of course, the international settlement, Britain, America, and the Shanghai Municipal Council with the Shanghai Municipal Police, a treaty port, not a colony like Hong Kong at the time, but a treaty port, an international city, which is very important in this story because it's the only city in the world in 1937 where you can arrive without a passport. It's the only city in the world in 1937 where you do not need a visa. You can just arrive in this city and you can declare any name you like, any country of origin you like, and you can say who you are. And this is why the contradiction of the treaty port of Shanghai, which was, of course, established by the unequal treaties between Britain and China after the Opium Wars, becomes this haven for many Chinese during the Taiping Rebellion and later on during the Warlord period, but also for the White Russians, those Russians that did not wish to live under the Bolsheviks and became stateless. And many of them came to Shanghai. And of course, slightly later, just after this period, for the Jewish refugees that came from Nazi-occupied Europe to Shanghai as well. It was a haven for all of them, even though it was this colonial, semi-imperialist concession created by the unequal treaties. Anyway, the Japanese, of course, only attack the Chinese portions of the city around the outside of the international settlement and the French concession. The international settlement was where the British and Americans and everyone else decided to run everything together. It would make more sense. The only country that disagreed with that were the French. Funnily enough, they wanted to do their own thing and not have anything to do with everybody else. So this is sort of, so you know, there's a pattern there, perhaps, that you might see in history. Sorry, Didier, I know. And they created their own French concession, rather wonderfully, architecturally, of course. So the Japanese attacked everything around it. So the Chinese tried to destroy the Japanese flag carrier, but it didn't work. And the bombs were actually Chinese bombs that fell on Nanking Road, outside the Cathay Hotel at 4:27 p.m. on Saturday, August the 14th. And the second series of bombs fell outside the Great World Amusement Center, which has just been refurbished after a fashion, on Tibet Road, or Shizanglu now, and they fell there. Those were Chinese bombs as well. So it's a very complicated moment in history, but it is a Japanese attack. And as you can see here, this is the picture on your left, is outside the Cathay Hotel and the Peace Hotel on Nanking Road, just by the Bund there. And the one on the right is obviously this foreigners, Shanghai landers, those foreigners that lived in Shanghai, watching the war going on in what is now Jiabei and Baoshan, Chapei, Baoshan, and Jiangwen, out to the north of Shanghai. And they're watching the Japanese shelling going in and blowing that up. So everything changes on this day. And Shanghai is, of course, effectively surrounded. The international concessions are surrounded by the Japanese. The Japanese, of course, move on through Suzhou and so on. And by September that year, of course, the horrific rape of Nanjing occurs. So, and they keep on moving. And the Chinese government goes to Chongqing at the top of the Yangtze to try and organize the resistance against the Japanese. So this is when everything changes. But for me, what happens on that day is really important for City of Devils. Until then, all of the criminal organizations in Shanghai, the vast majority of them, apart from some minor criminals and everything, was of course the famous Du Yue Shung, Big-Eared Du, and the Green Gang. It was run by them. And this is who everyone thinks ran Shanghai all of the time. But Big-Eared Du decides to leave Shanghai in August 1937. He goes first to Chongqing, where he stays for a while with the nationalist government, and then eventually he comes to Hong Kong, where he lives out his days on a British government pension. The deal was that the British government gave him a pension here as long as he didn't engage in any criminal activity. I am thinking of approaching the British government and promising not to engage in any criminal activity if they will indeed give me some sort of pension for my old age. I think it's rather unlikely. Anyway, that was what happened to him. So all of the foreign gangsters, the foreign gangs that had been operating in Shanghai from many different countries, American, British, Portuguese, Spanish, some Japanese gangs, Korean gangs, and various others. Mexican, that was one of the major ones as well. Everything that had been happening fell into their lap. And Shanghai became what the Chinese call Gudao, which you can translate as the solitary island or the lonely island. On three sides, the concessions of Shanghai are surrounded by the Japanese. And on the other side is the Huangpu River and the only access to the sea. But the evacuation ships are few and far between. And most of the people that I'm writing about can't leave anyway. Either they're criminals who are wanted back in their home countries. One of my characters is an American who escaped from Oklahoma State Penitentiary burnt his fingerprints off with acid, changed his name, arrived in Shanghai, told everyone his name was Jack Riley, ended up running bars and slot machines and becoming a millionaire. Other people came from Russia. They had nowhere else to go. They were stateless. They had no other city that they could go to, no other passport that could get them out of the country. And of course, the Jewish refugees that came, they had no passports. They had no state anymore. So after 1937 into 1938, 1939, we have a city that is surrounded by the Japanese and completely inhabited by people who cannot, by and large, leave. The Chinese can't leave either because, of course, that would mean going into Japanese-occupied territory. So to talk of some of the journalists who were there on Bloody Saturday and covered it and wrote about these events, I'd like to talk about three in particular. On your left is Vanya Oakes, who's a great favorite of mine. She wrote several wonderful books. If you look up Vanya Oakes on the internet, you can probably find her in some second-hand bookshops. She's not been reprinted for years, sadly. And she came to Shanghai shortly before Bloody Saturday, and she wrote about all of those events exceptionally well. If you know Shanghai, of course, the Battle of Shanghai took place north of the Suzhou Creek in Hongkou and up into Jiabei and Baoshan. She was staying in the Astor House Hotel, which is sadly just closed and will be closed for a couple of years to reopen, get this as the most Shanghai of moments, as a museum of money. You know, like what other museum does Shanghai need, really, to sort of understand? And she stayed in that hotel, which was very dangerous. When the bombs fell outside the Cathay Hotel on Nanjing Road, she needed to get back to call her bureau back in America and to radio in her story, telegram in her story. And in order to get across, there were so many Chinese surging across the Garden Bridge, the Waibaidu in Shanghai, that she had to sampan hop, which I couldn't really imagine how you do that until I looked at the photographs. But there were so many sampans hiding from the bombing that was taking place on the Huangpu River in the Suzhou Creek that you could literally, she took off her high heels and ran from one to another to another to another. But bombs were falling and hitting sampans and blowing them up. So she really got stuck in the middle of it. Randall Gould, the man in the middle, was one of the greatest journalists, really, to ever report from Shanghai. He ran the Shanghai Evening Mercury and also reported for United Press. And he had the penthouse flat for many years at Broadway Mansions, which, again, if you know Shanghai, is just the other side of the Garden Bridge by the Astor Hotel, but just on the other side. And he would go up on the roof there and report the locations of where all the bombs were falling. A very amazing journalist. If you read you can read his reports online, and they're incredible. And Bud Ekins, who was the United Press correspondent, really was out there with the Japanese and the Chinese, right in the middle of where they were fighting in Jiabei. And they were sniping each other a lot in what was then around the North Railway Station. And he was up there reporting on that. And he was wearing a tin helmet, a sort of army tin helmet. And several times bullets pinged off this helmet as the Japanese snipers tried to sort of shoot him. He had a stars and stripes on the front of it. And he was always slightly suspicious that it might have been the Chinese nationalist soldiers that were trying to shoot him, because the rumor was that, of course, if some Americans got killed, that would be good for Chiang Kai-shek, because it might bring America into the war early. But nothing could get the Americans into a war early, so that didn't happen. The area I'm writing about in City of Devils is called the Badlands. And it's this area to the western side of Shanghai. If you know Shanghai, Great Western Road is Yan'an Road, Avenue Haig is Huashanlu, Yuyuanlu sort of runs down towards Zhongshan Park, and so on. It was a very nice area of Shanghai, but it was just beyond the control of the international settlement and just beyond the French concession. So it became an area that, instead of being a nice suburb of Shanghai, became an area where casinos, brothels, and opium dens and drug dealing parlors were thrown up. And between summer of 1937 and, well, when Shanghai ends completely as an independent entity on Pearl Harbor on December the 8th here, of course, in 1941. This became the Badlands of Shanghai. Mostly the casinos were owned by foreigners. The one I write about in my book is owned by a Austrian Jewish exhibition dancer who ran the chorus lines at the Paramount Ballroom and ran the chorus lines at the Canidrome nightclub in Frenchtown, which were the most amazing, anything to rival Paris or London or New York at that time. And he made enough money to open a casino here. But it was very difficult because you have to deal with the Japanese, and not just the Japanese, but by this time you had to deal with the Chinese collaborators, the Chinese puppets under Wang Jingwei and his government as well. So this is the Badlands, and lots of people say, well, was it ever called the Badlands? Don't you just make that up because it's an exciting and sexy name? And I say, well, Badlands is exciting and sexy, but it's also the official name. And this is probably one of the greatest foreign journalists of interwar Shanghai, John Powell, who was very pro-Kuomintang, but was a great journalist, I think. And this is his weekly newspaper, the magazine that he put out called the China Weekly Review. And this is from that period. And he talks about the Badlands in both of these. So Badlands was really an American term for a red light area, but it denoted more than just prostitution. It denoted drugs, it denoted bars, all sorts of vice in all its wonderful forms. It was extremely violent, and very violent for the journalists that were trying to write about it as well. This is the car of a Shanghai Municipal Council official who decided to go and see how bad the Badlands were. And he went with a group of various journalists, British, American, and so on. And as his car drove through the Badlands, for him to see just how bad the Badlands were, of course, it got machine gunned. And you can see here from the police reports the bullet holes in his car. And he got down fairly quickly on the back seat and drove out of there very, very swiftly and never went back. It was extremely dangerous. The usual headline that journalists came up with was Chicago on the Huangpu, was the one that they rather liked. And it wasn't an unfair description, really. Anyway, to move on a little bit and to talk about the journalists, this period was really quite chaotic as it advanced through 1938, 1939, 1940. So the Shanghai Municipal Police and the court system in the international settlement and the French concession began to collapse. Of course, in 1940, France falls to the Germans, and Shanghai is taken over by the Vichy government, which is sympathetic to Japan, of course. So effectively that becomes run by the Japanese. And times get very hard for journalists. As we get towards 1940 and 1941, towards Pearl Harbor, we start to see the arrest of some journalists as well. Now this is Victor Keane, described here as the New York Herald Tribune, and J.B. Powell that I referred to earlier. J.B. Powell is a wonderful character, a very straight man in a sense. There's nothing really to sort of say about him apart from the fact that he was a great journalist. Victor Keane is a somewhat different sort of man. Victor Keane was a great journalist and reported well on Shanghai during this period, but he had a slight problem, and that was women. And there were rather a lot of beautiful women around in Shanghai at that time of not much means. He actually had an American wife, and they got married in the middle of, on Bloody Saturday. He stopped reporting for half an hour to go and get married to his wife, and then immediately went back up on the roof and started reporting again on the bombing of Shanghai. She was a very understanding woman, because not only did she put up with being taken to a war for a honeymoon, which not many people would, but he also had a long-running White Russian mistress that he'd had before he got married and kept after he got married. And his wife was so understanding that the White Russian mistress was renowned for being extremely beautiful. But in all other respects, apart from speaking a little bit of French and being quite a good dancer, she was completely and utterly useless. She couldn't clean the flat that he put him in. She couldn't cook. She couldn't look after herself. She didn't know how to do her laundry. And Victor Keane's wife, because he was so busy reporting on the Japanese attack on China, had to go over and do all of his mistress's laundry and cook her some food, otherwise she'd have starved, and basically sort of clean the apartment so that when Victor came back to his mistress from a hard day's reporting, it wasn't completely filthy. And I think that this is obviously above and beyond the call of duty. I mean, it's quite ridiculous. So Victor Keane, but his reports are absolutely amazing. He was, along with J.B. Powell, his reports were so good on the Japanese, and they condemned the Japanese so much. And in America, they solicited so much support for the Chinese life and death, by that point, struggle against Japan, that the first two foreign journalists to be arrested by the Japanese after Pearl Harbor were Victor Keane and J.B. Powell. And both of them were taken to the notorious Bridge House, which here you'll see it here, which was an apartment building that, of course, Didier will know it very well. I can see his face there. Doug will know it very well. Which was, of course, turned into a torture chamber by the Japanese. Victor Keane managed to get on an evacuation ship, as did J.B. Powell. When J.B. Powell was put on the Gripsholm, one of the evacuation ships to be negotiated by the Swiss Red Cross to leave Shanghai, people joked that he was called Gandhi. He had lost so much weight, and he had had beriberi, which made his skin darker. And on the voyage back to America, which sort of went via Africa, he had to have both of his feet amputated due to having been beaten on the feet with bamboo the whole time. It was an extremely, so that was the cost of reporting the Japanese attack on Shanghai. I'll talk a little bit about, this is where the Shanghai FCC was. Now, of course, you know, of course, that your FCC is not the first FCC. There was another FCC before. Well, there were several FCCs before, actually. And they were here in the Broadway Mansions, which is still, of course, just the other side of the Garden Bridge. This is the Bund here. Many journalists lived in the Broadway Mansions. It was a very nice place to live. And as I'll go on to say, you could afford to live in the Broadway Mansions at that time as a journalist, even a freelance journalist. You'd find that very difficult to do nowadays. Many did live there, including several who were imprisoned by the Japanese. And several were also beaten up there as well. Halit Arband, who, if you can ever get hold of any of Halit Arband's books, which you can get secondhand, about his time as the New York Times correspondent during the 1930s and 40s, excellent books about this period in China. He really was a great reporter. He lived on the 16th floor, which is almost the top floor, and his stories, which of course were read by the Japanese, were so effective in, again, soliciting support in America for China against Japan, that the Japanese military police, the Kempeitai, burst into his apartment and beat him black and blue and nearly threw him out the window. Only at the last minute was he saved from being thrown out of the window. Many other people lived here. And eventually, Randall Gould had one of the flats there as well, and he was really the doyen of the Foreign Press Corps. And it was really because he lived there that the Foreign Correspondents Club ended up being formed in this. Now, I should have put the picture in this presentation, but there's a very famous picture that you'll know of Chinese refugees streaming across the Garden Bridge, trying to get into the international settlement. And that was taken from Randall Gould, apartment, which became the Shanghai FCC, from his window, looking down onto that bridge. There had been a number of FCCs before that. It's arguable which was the first. Those journalists that went to Yan'an, that went to see the communists in their caves in Yan'an, did form an FCC there. They actually had a house just outside. Everyone believes that everybody lived in caves there, but of course, whenever a photographer turned up, they lived in caves. Some of the other time, they didn't live in caves. There were houses nearby. And the FCC there actually had a 24-room house all the rotating journalists who came to see Mao, of course, after Edgar Snow and everyone wanted to see Mao. And so they rotated through this club room in Yunnan. Chongqing, which of course was the wartime capital, had a place called the Press Hostel. And that was a very famous building in there, which also was a press club, which I think we can call a foreign correspondence club, although they didn't call it that. And Teddy White from Time and Annalee Jacoby. Everyone always talks about Teddy White, Mrs. Annalee Jacoby. If you look at their book Thunder Out of China, you'll see it's Teddy White and Annalee Jacoby. We should remember that she was a great journalist as well. Often gets forgotten. They were the sort of guiding forces of the foreign correspondence there. And they were in a place called the Press Hostel, which was apparently absolutely bug-ridden. And the walls were very, very thin. And many of the journalists either took up with local girls or brought their wives with them. And apparently it was terrible with the amount of... because the bombs were falling and everyone knew that they might die tomorrow. Of course, tonight is the last night that you might... you don't want to miss, do you, right? So you don't want to die sort of, not having made love the night before. So everybody there would be this raucous lovemaking every evening through these rather flimsy walls. And some journalists, the more pious ones, would sort of complain about it, which was rather unfortunate. And then, of course, there was slightly towards the end of the war, there had been a club, certainly after 1945, called the International Club, which was also for foreign correspondents in Nanjing. Once the capital was able to move back to Nanjing, and we get into the Civil War period between, obviously August 1945 through to 1949. And there were many journalists that went to that one. But I think the one in Shanghai and the one in Broadway Mansions is really the one that we can say is the precursor of your club here. And I remember coming here in 2009 on the 60th anniversary here, having written a book having been the only person who bothered to write a book about the history of foreign correspondence. So obviously they had to invite me to sort of come and talk. And I came here, and it was particularly wonderful for me, not only to talk to a wonderful audience about that, but they found as many original members as they could. And I was introduced to a retired Shanghainese man who had lived here since 1949, who had been the young man who was the barman up at the Broadway Mansions, at the bar in Broadway Mansions. And when, as I'll talk about, they managed to get the club out just before Mao took the city, and they managed to get the entire club out with some money and bring it to Hong Kong. The people that did it also grabbed this young guy and said to him, "You do not want to stay here, right? You have worked for a number of years serving drinks to all the worst spies, traitors, and foreign infiltrators in China ever. You need to go." And he wasn't married or anything, and he did, and he came to Hong Kong, where he ended up being the first barman at the FCC when it was established here. He had seen his whole career through here and retired, and it was lovely to meet him, who had come here. But it wasn't without difficulties. When we get into this period of the Civil War, everyone became very suspicious. Not least, the communists were the second problem that you had. The first problem you had was the nationalists, who were losing. Chiang Kai-shek was losing and about to bolt for Taiwan. And at that time, two of the leading lights in the FCC were Graham Jenkins, who was a Reuters correspondent, and George Vine, who worked for the North China Daily News, which was the great English language newspaper of Shanghai. And they were both arrested because they had submitted stories from Shanghai showing the various troop movements just outside Shanghai of the nationalists and the communists. And this was considered treachery, and they were both arrested and condemned by the Kuomintang, by Chiang Kai-shek, to death. This was not good. Clyde Farnsworth, who worked for the New York Herald Tribune at that time, who was the president of the Shanghai, which they called the China Foreign Correspondents Club at this point, went and tried to negotiate with the Kuomintang to release these two guys. It wasn't looking good. They had not been, as I assume many journalists are not historically, very good prisoners. They had been getting into fights with their guards, and one had managed to knock the front tooth out of the face of one of the guards. So the negotiation was not only these maps are not particularly sensitive, number one. Number two, if you shoot 2 American journalists, this will not go down very well with the people who are paying for your war against the communists, which is Washington, D.C. And number three, Graham Jenkins is willing to pay for the dental treatment for the guard whose front tooth he knocked out. And so that can be arranged. And so they were eventually released, which I think is really a great achievement by Clyde Farnsworth, who had to run back to Broadway Mansions, to arrange the farewell to Shanghai party, because it was 1949 and they were about to invade. Now, the FCC, I don't know what the property of the FCC is nowadays, but the FCC in Shanghai at Broadway Mansions was the proud owner of an amount of furniture, which it sold for several $1,000s at the time, and 3 US Army Jeeps, which were available for any member that needed them to go and report. I don't know if you have Jeeps here, Victor, but no, have you got Jeeps parked downstairs ready to go in case there's trouble in Causeway Bay with a, yeah. So they sold those as well for the princely sum of $150 US each, which even in 1949 money wasn't very much for a Jeep, although who bought them, unfortunately, was not recorded. This meant that George Vine and Clyde Farnsworth were able to leave Shanghai with the enormous sum of $10,000 US and come to Hong Kong, which is where everyone was coming. And they went to the old Dairy Farm restaurant, which was on the mezzanine floor of Windsor House. And they set up, with this $10,000, the Hong Kong Foreign Correspondents Club, which had a grand total of 11 members. I would not have bothered to come and give a talk to the Hong Kong Foreign Correspondents Club in November 1949. It would have been a complete waste of time. And they soon moved from there to a house in Coatwall Road, which I'm reliably informed has a plaque on it that says that that's where they were. But what was interesting about that was it was a private house, and they rented this private house. And unfortunately, there were complaints from the neighbours that the Guilo journalists that had set up a club there were making noise. So when you went in, there was a sign above the bar, which had this nice young man who'd been rescued from Shanghai and taken down serving gin and tonics and so on, which said, please, you know, like signs do nowadays, please respect our neighbours and keep the noise down. How successful this was, I don't know. Not very successful, I suspect, because they were evicted. And did manage to find this property here, which they were able to take over. And so Clyde Farnsworth, once he became here, who had negotiated the release of these guys, became the first president. And rather wonderfully, the second president, a man I wish I'd met, who was also a UPI man, who had been in Shanghai, called Monty Parrott, which I think is a superb name, Monty Parrott. I've never met anyone with the surname Parrott. And, but he was a real journalist, and he became the second president. So just to finish off, how do you live as a journalist in China in the first half of the 20th century compared to how do you live as a journalist in the first half of the 21st century? I have no idea how you live as a journalist in the first half of the 21st century, but let's start with George Morrison, right? Morrison of China, and he lived here on Morrison Street, which is now Wang Fujing. How many of you have barricades outside your house in order to prevent attack by various people on May the 4th, 1919 and so on, and have an entranceway to your house like that? Not for everyone to go through, just for you to go through. This is your house. Here's Morrison outside his enormous courtyard, his Siheyuan house with his boater, and he's standing there. George Morrison was the Times correspondent, of course, so he was a full-time salaried employee of the Times at this time. So he did have quite a lot of money. He had the largest single private library in Peking at that time. It's quite interesting to me because he sold it eventually to Japan, where it still resides. And the second largest private library, which became the first largest private library, belonged to E.T.C. Werner, who was the father of the girl who was murdered in my book, Midnight in Peking. That's just a little thing that interests me. Doesn't have to interest you, particularly. Here's Morrison with a couple of the servants' children, sitting on his steps. He lived there largely alone, although he had many girlfriends, and occasionally he had his wife, though she didn't hang around for very long. But this is the sort of life you could have as the Times correspondent in China at this point. I'm not particularly sure where the Times correspondent for China, or even if the Times has a correspondent in China anymore, where they live. But I'm not sure it's this house anymore. This is his library, by the way, which you can see is a rather wonderful library, and various group of people. People will come from all over to see his library. It's really quite an amazing library. J.P. Marquand, who most of you will know, if you know him at all, as the man who managed to get out of journalism by creating the Mr. Moto series of novels, which of course became the famous series of films. He originally was working for the New York Observer in China. And this is where he stayed. So he was reporting for the New York Observer, and this was the house that he managed to have. I don't know how many people have a house like this now as foreign correspondents in Peking, but this is rather nice. Here's another shot. There's his servants down at the end there. He was obviously able to furnish it. Most of these were his furnishings. And they all went back to America with him. He had a rather beautiful apartment, large apartment in Boston, where he was originally from, that most of these things eventually went back to. But most foreign journalists, I don't think, have apartments like this. Edgar Snow, the good lefty and pro-communist, who of course would tell us all that we were terrible capitalists, lived a rather wonderful life in the mid-1930s in Peking as a freelancer with his wife that you see here, the much better writer, actually, and the much more savvy political writer, Helen Foster Snow. This is their dog, Gobi. This is them outside their entire courtyard, their Sehe Yuan courtyard in the eastern city of Peking, where they had a tennis court, as well as a writing shed, which they called a shed, but when you actually look at pictures of it, was rather an elaborate garden house, and an enormous house with about 7 servants. And just because that's not quite enough for a freelance journalist in 1935, they had a racehorse out at the Peking Race Club that Edgar didn't ride because he was a bit too big, but that was very successful as well. So, and remember, both of these were freelancers. They weren't even full-time salaries. They lived as freelancers. But Americans did extremely well in the 1930s because the currency was linked to silver. And silver in China, due to the strength of the Mexican silver dollar and the silver tile, meant that you were extremely wealthy. So even with everything with depressed wages, obviously, for labor and servants, they could live an incredible life. Shang Mei Li, better known as Emily Hahn, of course, of The New Yorker, lived here on the Avenue Joffre, now the Huahai Road. And she lived here with her lover, the poet Zhao Xinmei, the Chinese poet. And they had this house, which was an absolutely beautiful house at the time that they lived in it. Her first flat, when she first came to Shanghai, where she planned to stay for a couple of months but didn't leave, was another beautiful apartment on Kiangxi Road, now Jiangxi Road, down near the Bund. And near there were all the famous brothels which were run by American madams. And she bought all her furniture from a brothel, which is quite fitting for Emily Hahn, if you know anything about her history. And put it in her apartment. But then when she fell in love with Zhao Xinmei, which was a good relationship, they created great journals of modern writing and so on. But she did become an opium addict, which is perhaps a slight downside. But this is where they lived, which have just been redeveloped, actually, by some Taiwanese buyers into, well, I'll let you make a decision as to whether or not you think it's better or worse in terms of the development, but there goes Shanghai, unfortunately. Where did most of the foreign journalists live? Well, just to give a couple of buildings, you've seen the Broadway Mansions, very impressive building. Many of them lived in the Cathay Mansions, Sir Victor Sassoon's building, which you'll see now, Maoming-lu, still rather wonderful. And here are a bunch of journalists. J.B. Powell is in that picture somewhere, sitting outside. This is 1948. It's 6 months, really, before Shanghai falls to the communists. And here they are sitting outside in their wicker chairs, having a gin and tonic, not thinking that it's ever going to happen. And the other building that they all lived in, which is still a wonderful building that you can see, of course, is the Embankment building. Journalists started moving into this building pretty much immediately after it was finished in the early 1930s. Enormous building down on Suzhou Creek. And they lived there for a long time, even when, after the Second World War, the Americans occupied much of that, and the United Nations Refugee and Rehabilitation Organization that sought to work out where will all these white Russians and where will all these refugee Jews go after the war moved in. Many journalists stayed there. They all got kicked out of Broadway Mansions, which the US Army took over completely, apart from the floor that the FCC was on. And that's that, I'm afraid. My book finishes on Pearl Harbor, so I've gone on a little bit to show you some journalists. But hopefully that's of some interest to the FCC. Thank you.
Absolutely. Can we get some sound here? Do I have to press a button? Sit down, please. Yeah, go ahead. Thank you so much, Paul. That was absolutely fascinating. And, you know, especially for some of us, we actually, even though we're on the board of the club, we don't all know the origins of the club. You press a little button here, it should go green. Yeah, that's it. I'm going to ask a few questions, and I'm sure a lot of you who are having dinner here have your questions as well. Just to sort of go back to your last point, how much of old Shanghai is still around? The Cathay Hotel, that's the Peace Hotel, is that right? You know, and I think you do tours, don't you? Or you have arranged a tour? Or you tell us how much is still there.
Well, I do in Peking, which is remarkable what's left there in Beijing. But Shanghai, most of those buildings are still there. The Embankment building's still there. Broadway Mansions is still there. Of course, the Garden Bridge is still there. Bund is still there. So most of those classic buildings are still there. A lot was lost. There used to be an area, when I first went to Shanghai, down near the Bund, which was known as Newspaper Row. And that was where all the China Weekly Review and many of the other newspapers had been. And that all got knocked down a few years ago. But if you go along the Bund, you can still see what was called the Old Lady of the Bund, which was the offices of the North China Daily News. That's still there. So although there's, of course, so much that's gone, some of these were in such iconic buildings that it would be reasonably difficult to knock these down. So it's not too bad.
Is that a picture of Shanghai behind that window there? Is that the Bund? Looks like it, doesn't it?
This one is
the one on the left.
Yeah,
the one on the right, I assume, is Hong Kong, but the one on the left, yeah.
Yeah. So you can see you came from here and you've ended up here.
I've never noticed that before. You know, you describe this kind of essentially a paradise for journalists. This is astonishing story that, of course, any journalist would give their right arm to write about, and some of them actually did, by the sounds of it. And also a place where you could go without a passport or a visa. I don't know how many of us would love to have that today, you know, having paid more than $100 just to get a visa to go for the weekend to Shanghai. But how on earth, apart from the Americans with their silver dollars, how on earth did journalists and everybody else afford this kind of lifestyle that you describe? Is it just that it was very cheap to live there, or was it just that journalists and others were better paid, or were the journalists who were freelancers, were they just privately wealthy people who did journalism as a hobby? What were the sources of their income? I mean, were they actually just very well paid by their employers?
There were so many journalism jobs. Everybody had 2 or 3 jobs. So you would normally get yourself, if you possibly could, accredited to a foreign newspaper. And you would get a salary from them. You would often be stringing through the telegrams to other people, often sometimes anonymously, sometimes in the knowledge of your other employer. And then you would try and get a job on the local newspapers. So Shanghai in the 1930s had what? The North China Daily News, the China Press, the Shanghai Times, the Shanghai Mercury and Evening Post. That's just in English. Then there's the French newspapers and Russian, Yiddish, Ukrainian, I mean, every language you can think of. So you could string or write for those as well. And then people were selling stories all over the place. The thing that's really hard to sort of get across to people, I think, and sometimes is a bit controversial because journalists, particularly younger journalists today, don't like it, is that China was such a bigger story then than it is now. It was an enormous story in the 1920s and 30s. And of course, China is a significant story now. But in terms of column inches in newspapers, forget the fact that there are a lot less newspapers, but in terms of column inches in newspapers, the New York Times had 8 people reporting full-time across China. Right? So most of the regional newspapers of America had people, and the UK and France. So they had many, many more people writing about many, many more things. Now, China's a big story today in economic terms, and occasionally things happen. South China Sea's a bit of a spat. In my time in China, I remember everyone calling me up about the bra wars, you know, with the European Union, tariff wars. I mean, we've been through tariffs any number of times. You know, these people think are big stories. The spy plane thing on Hainan, the NATO bombing of the embassy in Sarajevo, whatever. These were all big stories. This is nothing compared to the Taiping Rebellion. 15 million people dead, right? The ever-victorious army with Charles Gordon repulsing them. This is nothing compared to the warlord era of China. The end of 1911 and the end of the Qing dynasty. 270-year-old dynasty collapses, replaced by a republic. Right? This is an enormous story. And then we go into the warlord era. And the warlord era, the story is not even just China. It's whether or not China will even continue to exist. Right? It could splinter into 50, 60, 70 different states, right? All run by their warlords. There's no unitary central government until at least 1927, 1928, 1929. And then the Japanese come piling in, right? I mean, they annex Manchuria in 1931. Well, that's an enormous amount of territory to be annexed by Japan. And then, of course, they annex 1937, they move into Peking, Shanghai, Tianjin, down to Shanghai. The rape of Nanjing is an awful event. I mean, it's a Holocaust, right? And then the war goes on for China from the summer of 1937 to, you know, the summer of 1945. These are enormous stories. The scale of earthquakes as well going on, flooding, everything else that's taking place. China's enormous.
It's not just that there was a war. Obviously, that makes it a much bigger story. But the interesting thing is that the readers in New York, in Chicago, in London, in Paris were really interested in these stories, right? I mean,
yes.
Even before the war broke out, you just had interest in what was happening in China. That's I think a really interesting phenomenon that we've forgotten about. We tend to think that everyone sort of forgot about China for hundreds of years. And in fact, what you're saying is that's not true at all, that it was a very big story.
It was on the front page of the newspapers.
In the European press, in the American press. Yeah.
And think of all the reasons it was on the front of the newspapers. Bloody Saturday in August 1937 is the largest death toll of civilian aerial bombing in history at that point.
To date, yeah.
Yeah, it's way beyond Guernica. And it doesn't get exceeded until a couple of years later when the Japanese bomb Chongqing.
Do we know how many people roughly were killed at that point? Or?
Well, it's very difficult because, of course, most of the figures we have come from the international settlement and the French concession, and they come up with figures between 3,000 and 5,000. But we know that many, many more Chinese died but were not recorded at that time. So it could be a lot more than that. But say between 3,000 or 5,000, that's still way in excess of Guernica. And then it's not until 1940, really, and Chongqing, and then, of course, a year later, and London and the British cities and the Blitz, that we see the numbers get exceeded. So that's enormous at the time, Arguably, depending on how you calculate it, the trade coming out of particularly Shanghai and all of China as a percentage of world trade is, of course, greater than China's percentage of world trade is now, right? Depending on various ways of calculating it. So China is not yet back to having that share of world trade that it had in 1936 before the Japanese invasion. And also just the number of foreigners that in some way interacted with these places, right? So the number of people who had families, who had soldiers serving in Shanghai, or the Navy that were in the Far East Squadron in Shanghai, or people who were in the Chinese Maritime Customs, or people who were in the Shanghai Municipal Police. These people that I sort of communicate with all the time online. So it was much more a personal story as well.
So China, in a way, was a more Shanghai was a more global city then than it is now, in the sense of that. Yeah.
As a percentage of foreigners to Chinese, yes, much higher than it is now. In terms of the cosmopolitan nature of it, yes, as well. Sizable communities of Mexicans, sizable communities of Portuguese, which don't really exist anymore. It's not there's no Portuguese in Shanghai, but not nowhere near as many. The amount of places that foreigners could go was quite incredible. Its place within world culture, if you like, it hadn't been cut off from world culture. The nightclubs, the dance halls, the music, the modernity of Shanghai. It was between the wars, it was at any point the fourth or fifth, depending on how it was calculated, largest city in the world, behind London, Paris, New York, and then Shanghai and Berlin kind of changed. But of course, Shanghai is the most densely populated of all those cities. So it's one of the fourth or fifth largest city in the world. There's an awful lot of politics going on there. There's an awful lot of economics going on there. It is this unique system that's occurring there. So, and then all of that disappears sort of around, really 1937. It never really comes back fully. And then we sort of forget about it. And then we sort of suddenly discover it again in the late 1990s and say, isn't this amazing? Without sort of, our collective memory has sort of lost Shanghai, apart from these images of showgirls and opium and jazz and guns. There's this whole entire Shanghai story, which is so much more massive. But our collective memory has forgotten it in between.
Thanks so much. I think that's a great moment, because we've probably got 30, 40, 50 nationalities of people here now to open it up to any questions that you might have of Paul. We've probably got 10 or 15 minutes. Do we have a microphone? There's somebody, gentleman over there at the back. Yeah. And then just raise your hand, and we can just say briefly who you are and what your question is. Thanks.
I am Angus Forsyth, a member of the FCC. This may be a little beyond your focus, but the North China Daily News became the People's Daily. Can you tell us anything about the transition from one to the other?
Well, the North China Daily News had existed for an awful long time, and of course it was owned by the Morris family for many, many times. And if you've been to Shanghai, you've been to, you can go to the Morris estate and see the house that they built. They were also great racehorse owners. They won the Derby twice, actually. And Shanghai, which was a great betting town at that time, all bet on Morris horses, whatever the odds were. And the two times that Morris horses came in, the long bar at the Shanghai club was apparently drunk dry twice. It was like, and some people say it was the reason that cables were put into Shanghai earlier than other places, because they wanted to get the Derby results as quickly as possible. And it was a great newspaper, but it was very much the voice of, well, I think people always misunderstand it as the voice of Britain in Shanghai, and I don't think it was that. I think Arthur Ransom, who later became the children's author that did Swallows and Amazons, he wrote this great piece about the Shanghai mind of the foreigners that lived there. And I think the North China Daily News was the great articulator of that mindset, which was, the greatest imperative is the getting of money and the accumulation of money. And the control of Shanghai is essential to that for our business. And we expect the Royal Navy to protect us, but we're not going to pay any taxes to Britain. Right? Shanghai never paid a penny in tax to Britain. They paid some to the municipal council, but they never paid any to Britain. But as soon as there was trouble, the North China Daily News would demand gunboats to the Huangpu, even though they hadn't really contributed anything. But Britain always did send them. So what happened during the war, the North China Daily News was taken over by the Japanese, and many of the journalists were, of course, interned. But others, particularly the great white Russian cartoonist Sapaju, who worked for that newspaper, who wasn't interned as a white Russian, were forced to work for that newspaper during the war. And it pumped out pro-Japanese propaganda. After the war, it sort of limped back. And then, like many things, the way that the communists got rid of foreign businesses in Shanghai was to just give incredible tax demands, you know, with retroactive taxes that they felt should be paid. They were just enormous. So eventually it did sort of collapse. I mean, you're informing me that it became the People's Daily. Is that? I mean, I'm not sure. I think I didn't know that. I thought the People's Daily was just the People's Daily and the North China Daily ceased to exist. So, yes, well, that would have happened then. But the North China Daily News, you know, when was it? At Pearl Harbor in 1941, December 1941, the big thing that the Shanghai Municipal Council and the North China Daily News were planning was the centenary of Shanghai as a treaty port, right? 1842 to 1942. And when Pearl Harbor, and they had already laid up all of the articles for the great special edition they were going to do for the 100 years of Shanghai. And then the Japanese screwed that plan by invading on December the 8th. So all of that got lost. So Shanghai, unfortunately, only ever got to 99.5. It never got to 100. And the Shanghai Daily sort of limped to about 1951. And as you say, then it became something else. But yeah, it was the demise of a good newspaper. It's well worth flicking through. There's copies up at Hong Kong University and various other places you can go and look at. It's a great newspaper.
Thanks. And that point about governments piling on taxes is exactly what they've tried to do to newspapers recently in Cambodia, and I think in the Philippines as well, but certainly in Cambodia. Yeah, a question right in the middle at the back there, yeah. It looks like Alex, is it? Yeah.
Hello, Victor. Thank you very much. You were talking earlier about news coming out of Shanghai being widely promulgated and interesting to everybody in the 30s. And I'm just thinking about the UK in the 30s or Europe in the 30s that is obsessed with, you know, we're going to be at war in the next 2 years. And how does that work? Aren't people obsessed with what's going on at home and not thinking about China or Asia at all?
You mean obsessed with Europe or
obsessed with the European situation?
Rather than Asia, yeah.
No, I don't think so. I think they were very, very interested in what was happening in Asia. One, because they knew lots of people in Asia. Two, because there was British regiments and the Royal Navy involved in what was happening, even in terms of like evacuating people or protecting the international settlement. I also think that like there was indications as to what might happen in Europe that came from Shanghai, and that's a very, you know. Who was it? Was it Lloyd George?
Aerial bombing, you mean?
Yeah, this idea that the bomber will always get through. Shanghai seemed to indicate that, yes, that was absolutely right. Who was it said that? Lloyd George, or one of the prime ministers said that. The bomber will always get through. And it seemed to indicate that, yes, indeed, it would get through, and the toll would be horrific, right? So it allowed people to do that. One of the things I thought was interesting was I was doing a lot of research a few years ago about Chongqing and the bombing of Chongqing, which is really a blitz, right? The Mitsubishis come over from Japan and they refuel sometimes in China, occupied China, and they bomb Chongqing, and it's quite awful. And Chongqing, as you know, is a mountainous city. So they rushed people into the caves. And what they did was they put iron doors on the caves, and then they bolted those shut, and they thought, this is the way we can make it. And then in the morning, after the bombs had dropped, sometimes they would open these iron doors, and they would find everybody inside was dead. Right? Everybody was dead, but nobody appeared to have been blown apart.
Oxygen?
And this was this was due to the combustion of the explosion destroying your internal organs, but not sort of ripping you apart. And there's voluminous diagrams and notes going from the British Embassy, which is by then in Chongqing, back to London, saying, you can't do this, because when you put people in a cave and you put a door, there's no way for the air and the explosion and the blast to get out the other end.
Isn't that what they did in the London Underground?
Right, so
and
yeah.
Isn't that what they do in South Korea today with the shopping malls, the underground shopping malls?
The reason is you have to go into the underground, or you have to, it's better to stay on the surface, but have a way for the blast to hit if it hits outside, but for it to blow out. So Britain, and I presume the Germans as well, learned a very important lesson from Chongqing. But they're also concerned, if you remember, I should have put a picture of it up, Newsreel Wong, the journalist who has this great picture, and it's very dubious in terms of whether it's posed or not, of this small baby sitting on the train tracks at the South Railway Station, in Shanghai in 1937, right? And that was the most replicated photograph in America and then in Europe in 1937. And it just shows this little baby that's had all its clothes blown off, sitting on a rail track, and a Japanese bomber's landed. Now, there is another photo that shows Newsreel Wong's assistant positioning the baby on the tracks. And you can decide yourself whether you think it's fair or not. But what that did for support for China and donations for China and the creation of the Aid China movement, Medical Aid for China, and all the other groups that were able to get some help into China at that time is quite amazing. But yes, you're quite right in the sense that we all in the West tend to think of the war as being 1939 to 1945, or the Americans presumably of 1941 to 1945. But for China, this war starts really in August 1937. And I know that there are some Chinese historians now who want to say the Second World War starts in 1931 with the annexation of Manchuria. I'm not quite ready to go to that yet, personally. But I think August 1937 to August 1945 is long enough, really.
Thanks for that, and not least for reminding us that fake news is not as new as we all think it is. A quick question from Florence, who's French, despite your dissing of her of her nation, and she's also the president of the FCC. Anyway, she's going to ask a question, and then the lady over there.
Yeah, Florence de Changy. I'm with Le Monde, the French national radio. Well, first of all, thank you very much for this kind of lesson of history and reminding us where this fantastic club comes from. Two little comments on expressions you use. First of all, lazy freelance. It's the first time I hear this association, and I'm still struggling to come to terms with it. And the other one, you mentioned of this great fun journalist who had a problem, and this problem was woman. And the Shanghai is famous for the Shanghaiese woman, and I was wondering if you touch on this in your book, and what have you got to say about the Shanghai woman?
Well, no, I haven't got anything to say about the Shanghai woman. I'm not entering that snake pit in any way at all. Yes, they're all wonderful, hardworking, absolutely great. The reason I say lazy freelance was I was quite amazed at how, of course, I'm having a little poke at a room full of journalists, because, like, it's fun. But it's quite amazing how many of these journalists in the 1930s were able to survive without submitting very much work, right? Because the exchange rate was so good and the cost of living was so great that they really didn't need to. Helen Foster Snow, really didn't write very much from China, right? Later on, she wrote a lot of good books about her time in China, but she didn't write very much when she was there. But she's a great writer when she gets going. She spent most of her time modeling furs at the Camel Bell, which was a wonderful shop that existed in the lobby of the Grand Hotel de Peking, the Beijing Fandian on Chang'an and Wanfujing now. And she modeled furs there, and that was a very lucrative, because everyone she sold, she got like a commission. Right? So, like a lot of, I suppose, freelance journalists, she had other sort of gigs going on. Teaching English, even then, was like quite a good gig for some. But yeah, you didn't need to write a lot. Victor Keane and the other ones, most of the ones who got involved in women and got in trouble with women, it tended to be Russian. In the Shanghai crowd, it was the white Russian women that were the problem, or the solution. I don't know, but they were they were they were the problem. It wasn't so much the Shanghai woman. We haven't really got. I mean, they never really got into that period of. There's only one or two journalists who sort of ever married local women. It was that really didn't happen that much. It was mostly to do with the Russians.
My impression is that freelance journalism and paid journalism for a newspaper was basically a much better paid and easier job than it is today. Although, of course, there were dangers.
people shared jobs among themselves as well. And then people also, there were so many jobs. This is the thing, right? Not just stringers and this sizable local press. So if you're in Shanghai now, there isn't a local press to work for, unless you want to be a useful idiot and work for Xinhua or something, right? Or Global Times. Yeah. So there isn't really a local press to work for, whereas there was a significant local press to work for. I showed Vanya Oakes. She was the third real Western woman journalist to come to Shanghai. The Peggy Hull for the New York Observer was the first. The second was a woman called Edna Lee Booker, and she came as a freelance. And her other claim to fame in Shanghai is that she was the first female radio announcer in Shanghai on the foreign station that was called XHMA. And she was the first female announcer on that sort of got these Reuters reports off of the wires and then read them over the radio for everyone in Shanghai. So there were all these jobs that you could sort of get within journalism. People were also writing books. I mean, you think journalists all write books now when they go to China for 2 weeks and they turn out a book, right? I mean, you think that happens now. I mean, then it was insane, right? They would not just write their memoir. They would write their memoirs after a fortnight. They would write novels about China. They would write, examination. I mean, I was just writing recently about Arthur Ransom, right? Who later on went to do The Swallows and Amazons. I mean, he was there 4 months and he got a book out of China, right? And then a novel about China, right? So everybody was cranking out books. The China book thing was even more insane than it is now.
And there was demand. There was demand.
There was demand. They actually sold better than they do. Well, books, of course, sold better in general. But there was great demand. But I have a wonderful article by a great American journalist called Earl Leaf from 1934, I think. And it's in the J.B. Powell's China Weekly Review. And I always have this sort of printed off, and I quote from it all the time. And the title of it is something like, "For God's sake, no more China books," right? And this is 1934, and he's just like, "No more. We know everything. There's nothing else we need to know about China. I don't care if you've been to Tibet. I don't care if you walked across Gansu. I don't care if you rowed in a canoe down the Yangtze. It's done, finished, no more," right? And of course, clearly nobody ever listened to him.
Same about India. Lady there, yeah.
Yes, I'm Jeanette White. I'm not a journalist. I was quite intrigued to hear about the suffering that journalists got when they were captured. And also, today we hear a lot about the problems when journalists are operating in China or in other war zones. I'm just interested in your opinion on whether it was worse then or, have things got better or worse?
Oh, no, definitely worse then. I mean, in terms of losing your life. Yeah. So not to belittle when journalists get pushed around and beat up and occasionally thrown in jail now. But, I mean, and I'm talking about foreigners, not local Chinese. But yeah, very difficult on a number of fronts. One, you can't really predict what a warlord's going to do, right? Because if he decides to just have you killed, he'll have you killed. So Gareth Jones, wonderful journalist, Gareth Jones. Now, I heard that someone's doing a film about his life. I think Benedict Cumberbatch or someone is going to do a film about his life. He went to the Soviet Union and he uncovered the famine in the Ukraine when that other journalist whose name I can't remember sort of said it wasn't happening. Anyway, he uncovered it. He ended up going into Inner Mongolia where he was murdered. And to this day, no one's sure who murdered him. He wrote against the Japanese, so it could have been the Japanese. He wrote against the warlords, it could have been the warlords. He had a car and was Western, so it could have just been bandits. And also, he had uncovered the famine in the Ukraine, and some people say the NKVD, the Russian secret police, followed him into China and murdered him as well. So that happened a lot. People died. I mean, people got beat up. I told you, Jimmy Cox, who was a Reuters journalist, had his back and both of his legs broken when he was thrown out of his room by the Japanese police. Others were mistreated by the Japanese. So people, and the Kuomintang were not much better sometimes as well. Several journalists claimed that they had Kuomintang assassination squads try to get them for reporting that the Kuomintang might have been misusing American funds, Chiang Kai-shek, cash my check, and all of that, right? So And then there's several other journalists who get on the wrong side of warlords and get hatcheted to death. Plus the few who sort of, you know, drink bad water or eat bad food and die that way, or get murdered by their mistresses.
Yeah.
In the Middle East, you know, again.
In the Middle East, no, I don't.
I mean, if I can just sort of pick up that point. I mean, I think, you know, foreign correspondents, expats, if you like, who are, you know, most of us who are working journalists have had friends and colleagues who've been killed in places like Afghanistan, the Middle East, or Asia. But it is true, as Paul alluded to, that local journalists, you know, in the country concerned are usually in much more danger, both of being arrested and of being killed. You know, in Latin America, a lot of local journalists have been essentially assassinated by their enemies, whether they're enemies in the government or in the drug gangs and so on. And two of our colleagues right now from Reuters in Myanmar are in jail essentially for doing their jobs. They just wrote a story. They researched and wrote a story about what was going on in Myanmar. And you know, these two people, I mean, here at the FCC, we've had a petition which I think got more than 40,000 signatures, I think considerably more, and is still going, you know, to try and get them released, because all they were doing was their job. So it's true that you know, local journalists tend to suffer much more, but foreign correspondents, I think, have always, you know, even in that time and still today, are also at risk from time to time, especially in wars, and this was essentially a war. Right?
Well, it's worth pointing out that many of the ones that did get killed in the war sort of caught a stray bullet or something like that. I mean, and it's also important to say that by virtue of being overwhelmingly white men in China at that time, they kind of tended to get released and sent on their way. It was like a problem. It would have been an international incident and things like that, and that's probably not quite the
yeah, I mean, even today, you know, as a foreign correspondent, you're more likely to be expelled from a country where you've annoyed the government than you are to be killed or tortured or jailed. You know, it does happen, but on the whole, you tend to get expelled, which is why, you know, most news organizations will be reluctant to hire Chinese nationals as their sort of full-time correspondents within China, for example.
Chiang Kai-shek's greatest weapon against foreign correspondents, outside of Shanghai, which of course didn't have to listen to him, was they would simply stop, say for the Halit Arband, for instance, who wrote for the New York Times, who the nationalist government hated. They would simply stop all circulation of the New York Times outside of Shanghai through the postal service, which they controlled. The New York Times would say, right, and they would get rid of that journalist, and so they would acquiesce with what the nationalist government asked for, and then they would be allowed access to the Chinese postal service again for all the subscribers they had all around. So the newspapers were obviously quite spineless, even when, you know, the proprietors were quite spineless, even when the journalists were writing quite brave stories.
And cutting circulation of a newspaper or punishing it financially is something that the Singapore government has done quite recently to many publications, so that's worth remembering as well. So any more, perhaps two more questions about Shanghai. Yes?
Hi, Doug Clark, I'm a member. I'm going to give you a real softball, Paul, because you've forgotten one journalist that I think you have to tell everyone about. You mentioned Sam Teitelbaum in your book, who of course broadcasts for HMA, and he's probably one of the most colourful characters, so why don't you tell us about him?
Oh, thank you very much. Yes, Sam Teitelbaum is, well, I wouldn't exactly call him a great journalist, but he's certainly a great character, which is true of a lot of journalists, I guess.
Thank you.
Sam Teitelbaum was... Sam Teitelbaum is a guy that's a very big character in the book. And he, well, what the hell did he do? He turns up in Shanghai and he tells everyone he was a journalist he tells everyone actually that he was a policeman in Chicago who went up against the mob, Capone and the mob, right? Took bullets, got threatened, blah, blah, blah. Had to leave, became a journalist, wrote all these great stories against the mob in Chicago and everywhere else. And eventually he has to go, and he leaves and he comes to Shanghai. And he gets a job telling these stories that you know, may or may not be true. But it's the mid-1930s. Trying to follow up a story is quite hard, right? You can't just Google someone to find out. If someone tells you they used to write for the Chicago Tribune about Al Capone, what do, right? You know, you're going to write a letter. It takes 6 months to get somewhere. It takes 6 months to come back. How do you find things out? So he gets a job on the local radio station, and he's pretty good on the local radio. He builds up a fan base, and he's speaking against the Japanese and so on. But he also wants to wipe out the scourge of American criminals in Shanghai at this period that I'm writing about. So they make him a U.S. Marshal, because they can have U.S. Marshals in Shanghai to do with the U.S. court. And he becomes a U.S. Marshal. Now, I don't want to say too much because it's a spoiler, but thank you, Doug, for setting that up. But I have to say that no records whatsoever record a man called Sam Teitelbaum, who was ever a journalist in America, whoever was a policeman in America, whoever went up against the mob in Chicago or anything at all. It was a completely and utterly invented story that got him a job as a U.S. Marshal based on law enforcement experience that did not exist. It got him a journalism job based on journalism experience that didn't exist. But he was extremely successful at both things.
But do we know his real origins? Was he a crook?
We know nothing about him. We know that he was called something else. He may have been a man who was wanted for various crimes in the Great Lakes area. He had been in a shootout with the police, which had resulted in a bullet in the hip at some point. He had skipped America, come to Shanghai, of course got off the boat, given whatever name came into his head, Sam Teitelbaum as it happens, completely reinvented his entire life, his entire background. But, you know, without, apparently, as far as we know, any training, was a pretty effective law enforcement officer and a pretty good popular journalist. So, you know, all that journalism school and police school is a waste of time.
I think that's a very good place to end it. Thank you so much, Paul. That's been a really, really great discussion. Thank you. And it's my enormous pleasure. I can see you're the kind of guy who always wears a tie. So it's my great pleasure to give you this gift from the FCC. Thank you. And Paul will be around, and his books are outside. You're welcome to buy them, right? And
you're absolutely welcome to buy them.
And he'll even sign them for you, or he will even sell you a rare unsigned copy if he.
I will sign anything except a check.
Thank you so much.